Awesome. Hi, everyone. Welcome to WriteHive 2022. We hope that you've been having a great time and you've been learning a lot of stuff during these past few days and even the first day. So this panel is Beyond Hero's Journey, Non-Western Story Structures. We'll be discussing story structures that aren't really commonly discussed in craft books and how we can apply them. I'm Magz, my pronouns are they, she, and I'll be the moderator for this discussion. We'll have Shilpa start us off with the panelist introductions.
Thank you, Magz. It's wonderful to be here with both you and Keir today. My name is Shilpa Agarwal. My pronouns are she, we, her, and I'm from Indigenous Tongva land here in Los Angeles. So I just want to acknowledge that. And my present project is a very long-term project that is a trilogy based in India at the height of the British Raj. And I'm working on issues of colonial amnesia and reconstruction of the feminine body. And the fun fact about me is that I'm also a radio host on Ruckus Avenue Radio, which is the biggest digital South Asian radio station. And I have a show called Life Force, which is about the forces that awaken our lives. And I'm very interested in this process of transformation.
I love it. Keir, how about you?
I'm Keir Alekseii. I am talking to you from Trinidad and Tobago, which is where I was born and where I live, where I was raised. I'm an associate agent at Azantean Literary Agency, which I think is pretty cool. My pronouns are she, her. I keep forgetting that it's in my label too. I don't have any current projects to discuss, but I am open to queries for all of the writers out there who hope to seek hope to find an agent or hope to seek traditional publishing, a path in traditional publishing. And a fun fact about me is that I have 5 cats. And what happens when you have 5 cats is that they walk across the camera. So if you see weird disturbances in the background, it's probably a tail.
Awesome. And Cindy?
Hi, everyone. I'm Cindy Hung. I write as CH Hung, and my pronouns are she and her. I'm very happy to be here with WriteHive today. So thank you very much for having me here, and really excited to be talking about this topic today with Magz and Keir and Shilpa. So I write all over the place, as you might be able to tell. I write a lot of short stories, science fiction, fantasy, crime, nonfiction, personal essays. And one of my recent personal essays that just came out is from Choreo, which you can see the cover in my virtual background here. I'm talking about food, which is one of my favorite topics ever. And I also just had a story release in Analog Science Fiction and Fact in the May and June issue. Excuse me. And so, yeah, I'm really excited to have that story come out. Interesting fact about me. Well, I'm pretty ordinary, so I don't know if there's a lot that's interesting about me. But I have 4 cats and 2 dogs. So if you see them running around like here, if you see them running around, you might see a tail or something like that. I promise it is a earth creature and not some alien.
Well, this is great. I can see this is going to be a really wonderful discussion. So let's just get right into the questions. So first question, I'm directing it to you, Shilpa, which is, what are some story structures that you feel do not get enough audience exposure in the West?
Okay, thank you. So I think first we have to back up and understand that we have yet to emerge from the narratives of coloniality. And what I mean by that is that colonialism was a brutal historical process that's been over 500 years. And what it did was it not only worked on an economic level, so looting and pillaging the kind of indigenous economies and disrupting them and collapsing them. It interrupted on a political level, and it also interrupted most dramatically on a cultural level. Mm-hmm. So basically destroying traditional knowledges and ways of thinking, ways of perceiving, and what I'm going to use the word cosmology. So our cosmology is the way we and our ancestors have perceived from a certain geographic place and culture who we are, meaning all of those things. All of that has been disrupted. So when we think about the project now of decoloniality, of looking at non-Western story structures, we have to first understand that our minds are still deeply conditioned. You know, even if we are very radical or whatever, it's a spectrum in terms of like decolonizing ourselves. And so the more that we decolonize our own minds, the more that we can connect into maybe perhaps a pre-colonial self. And I'm saying this not in terms of like, the pre-colonial time does not exist anymore. So I'm not saying this, we need to go back. What I'm saying is we need to root ourselves. The people who have come from colonized countries and enslaved countries need to root ourselves in that and bring it into the present, because life keeps evolving, life keeps changing. So how do we evolve? So in terms of even a beginning point, we need to first understand that everything is deeply colonized, and even most writers of color, most everything that's coming out of academia is still deeply rooted in Western colonial narratives about who we are. And with that comes, and Frantz Fanon talked about this, a deep sense of cultural inferiority for the people from colonized countries. So there's so much going on in terms of just starting to think about non-Western narrative structures. And so what are they? Like, we can talk about writing that's nonlinear. We can talk about writing that's outside the hero's journey. We can talk about writing that has a different sense of time, linear versus cyclical. So, and also I would add to that writing that is outside of binaries. So Western cosmology is steeped in binaries: self, other, east, west, man, woman. Whereas many indigenous and pre-colonial societies had a much more fluid sense of being. And I can speak only from my own cosmology, coming from India and being Hindu, is that the cosmology was one of transcendence of binaries. There was an idea of transcendence of object, transcendence of mind, transcendence of binaries, so that you could hold everything, all the contradictions, shadows, light, everything in a whole. And so my trilogy is really about that wholeness, that encompassing. So there is no hero, villain. There's human beings that have all these qualities inside them. And then they're put in situations increasingly more suspenseful and harder situations. And what's going to come out? Is it the shadows? It is the light. Is it the shadows? It's the light, right? So that's how I kind of see non-Western storytelling kind of emerging.
That's fantastic. Now I need to read all your books. So Karen, do you have anything to add to that?
Certainly. So I have complicated feelings about this. I think I certainly agree wholeheartedly with what Shilpa has said. And this has been sort of what you've described has been part of my journey in discovering alternative structures to what we get sort of pounded with in Western writing. We get the 3-act and the Fichtean curve, and basically the 3-act in various shapes and forms, right? They all look the same. They all feel the same, or very similar. I do feel like every structure outside of that sort of common pyramid shape or common 3-part shape is underrepresented. Yeah. So story structures that don't get enough audience exposure here, certainly, like you mentioned, nonlinear, nested, cyclic, all of the so where I'm from in the Caribbean, and also my heritage is based in India, oral storytelling and the rhythm and repetition and those things that herald oral storytelling, right? That market, those things aren't necessarily as celebrated either in what we find often in Western structures and things like the hero's journey. And so I think that all of those things are underrepresented here. Some are receiving more attention recently. I think Kisho Teketsu is getting a lot more, what's the word I'm looking for? It's reaching a larger audience because of film, like movies like Parasite, and so on. It's beginning to reach a larger audience, but in general, it's still very underrepresented, still not reaching much of an audience on this side of the world, relatively speaking.
Yeah, I understand both your points because it's something that I've had to deal with as well, with trying to find variety in my stories. So we'll turn it to Cindy for a quick chat. What do you think, Cindy?
Shilpa and Keir have mentioned, definitely, yes, let's start with decolonizing our fiction. I think there's a really great Tumblr post, if you guys haven't heard of it, that's been going around for the last several years, by an author named Kim Yoon Mi. And I can definitely link that in the chat, so you guys can look it up while we're talking. But they do a really good job of rounding up a bunch of different story structures from around the world that people haven't heard of. I know Keir mentioned Kishikokutsu, which is the 4-act structure. Obviously, a lot of people are familiar with it because of Parasite, but also because Studio Ghibli, almost all of their movies follow that structure. So if you are a fan of Studio Ghibli movies, you have been absorbing the 4-act structure from that fashion. But yeah, so in this Tumblr blog post, Kim Yoon Mi outlines other story structures, like, for example, the Bengali widows structure, which I had never heard of before in my life. It's not my background, but it just sounded super fascinating, and just all sorts of different structures like that. Another story structure that I think is really interesting, and we've been talking about this in my writers group, in fact, is the second person point of view. I realize that it's kind of a craft choice rather than a specific story structure, but there was a really great article that just came out in the SFWA, the Science Fiction Writers of America, which I believe they're changing their name to be more inclusive than just America, which is great, but their newsletter about how the second person point of view appeals so much to marginalized writers, because a lot of our cultural story structures are framed with that kind of narrative. It's a second person POV. So for us, that structure is more natural to our ears when we hear it. And unfortunately, it's, we all know it's a very polarizing subject with acquisition editors everywhere, where they're like, don't ever write in a second person POV. That's just not what's done in a more traditional Western story structure environment. And yet we're missing out on a lot of great stories if we don't consider that, So there's that. And then I also wanted to talk about, funny enough, the story structure called Talk Story, which I came across when I was reading Maxine on Kingston. It is more specific to the Hawaiian Islands, but because her background, she did live in Hawaii for a while, but she's also Chinese. There was this mix of structures in the way she told her stories and incorporated the talk story structure that was very reminiscent of how my mother translated stories for us when we were younger, and passing down the stories of her childhood and her youth and her background. So I think, going back to some of what Shilpa and Keir said about the oral history of storytelling, a talk story is another story structure, which I don't think a lot of people know about, because it's not shown off enough in the Western storytelling world.
I love it. This is why I like this panel. You guys are great. So we kind of touched upon it with us, like, going into, like, okay, we're saying some differences, we're saying some similarities between this dichotomy, this binary of non-Western and Western storytelling. I'm putting quotes because we've now established that that's not really the greatest of framing we can do, right? So
Definitely.
I just want to kind of get more into, do you find a specific difference, one specific difference that you see between what has been shoved down a lot of people's throats as the traditional storytelling structure versus the any other storytelling structure that people may not be familiar with?
I think it's the single narrative, third person point of view, typically white male, and linear, I would say, is the traditional, and 3-act, so to speak, is pretty much the traditional structure of a Western narrative. But I would also want to say that it's really important as we decolonize that we don't simply reject the Western model or reject things that have been imposed upon us. I think that when you do that, you are still reinforcing the structures of coloniality because you are acting in opposition to something. So again, I would really urge this idea of encompassing and transcending. So what can we look at in the Western paradigms that is useful? And certainly I do use, I'm writing trilogy. So, you know, I'm using the novel form, but within that, how do I employ other forms of storytelling that are from my own background, or other backgrounds that I've seen, in terms of how do I use language? How do I use, you know, in the Mahabharata, they call the frame tales, framing devices, tales within tales. You were saying, Kara's nesting.
Nested.
How do I use multiple narrators? Things like that, that are really about kind of breaking this idea of the one story, the hegemony of the one story, right?
Yeah. So like basically, if I'm understanding it right, just for the audience listening in, like we don't want to just say one's really bad and one's really good.
No.
You want to integrate them so that way you're taking what was good of each one, or even what is bad of each one, if that's your purpose for your story, and creating a new form of storytelling that readers may not gotten a chance to see before.
Yes, and that's exactly right, except I would not use the word better. I would say what is resonating with
Resonance.
you. The resonance of, right. You know, we're all living in this kind of post-colonial, not post-imperial, but post-colonial world. And so how do we resonate, and how do we understand our own positionality within that resonance? And so I think that that's really important.
I am keeping that word in mind, because I knew that best was better was not the right word, but you pinned it for me.
I love that use of the word resonance too, because I think it's a very important part of why stories work and how stories work. So if we talk about that difference in structures between what we're calling the traditional Western, whether it's the 3-act or the 5-point, you know, where Freytag or whoever, they're all, to me, they all fit that same shape. And if we're talking about story structures outside of that, I think that change in shape also leads to a change in purpose very often. What we see, and Shilpa, I think you mentioned this, is that sort of that cishet white abled perspective, right? Male often also perspective, where agency, I think, is the thing that comes up the most when I talk about this, like from an editorial perspective with a lot of folks, is that what looks like agency for the cishet white male able-bodied person is not what agency looks like with everyone, and certainly not with people of color, certainly not from people of other marginalized backgrounds. And when we change shape, right, from that drive that creates the pyramid or the triangle or the curve that we see so often in Western story structure, when we change that shape, I think that we open the story to other purposes and to have other journeys, other kinds of journeys. And so for me, when because when we talk about the difference between that structure and others, it's vast, because literally no other structure is like that. None. Because this is distinctly linear, right?
Yeah.
It's distinctly linear. Cyclic structures are not like that. They're cyclic. Yes. Nested structures are not like that. The frame that you were talking about, they're not like that. Non-linear, obviously, if it's meandering for a reason. It's meandering, it's branching, it's returning to its original stream. All of those things. So to describe the difference between that structure and others, I think it's going to take way more than we've got time on this panel, because we have to look at each one. We have to look at each one and how each one not just changes the pacing and the vibe of a story, but how it allows you to choose a different purpose for your story, to tell something differently in a different way for somebody else, for somebody who's not that dominant sociocultural group. Sorry.
Yeah.
I love that, Kara. I like gotta put it in the editor standpoint. Like this is what I'm seeing. So Cindy, what do you think? How would you handle this question? We got a lot of juicy nuggets here.
Yeah, so the specific differences that we've talked about, besides, for example, the second person point of view that people like to experiment with different structures, also include things like conflict. I know one of the panelists touched upon this briefly, but one of the things that I struggled with a lot when I was first trying to get my stories in front of editors, and in our publishing world, a lot of them are very well versed with the Western story structure, is this idea of conflict and how your protagonist needs to be driven to be proactive, right? And that's why they're a protagonist. And it was very counterintuitive to my own storytelling style, because a lot of my stories come about because the character is struggling with something internal. It's about character development rather than, they're going out and seeking something, whether it's an answer that's internal to their, soul searching, or if it's an external MacGuffin that they're trying to find or whatever. But that was consistently the feedback I kept getting was, you need a more proactive protagonist. And I was very discouraged by this, because I felt like, but there has to be a way to tell a story where you don't have to have a protagonist constantly doing something. And there just wasn't a lot I was finding out there to support this theory that I had, that a protagonist can choose to be inactive, right? Being inactive is also a choice. And it wasn't until I started reading other nonfiction books, like, for example, Craft in a Real World by Matthew Salasis. And then also Vita Cruz had a really great article in Fantasy Magazine that recently came out. It's titled We Are the Mountain. And I'll provide a link to that in the chat as well, because it's a really great article. I think everyone should read it about about exactly that, about how a protagonist who chooses to be inactive is also making a choice. And it doesn't preclude them from being a protagonist just because they're not reacting to what's going on around them. Because sometimes a lot of us, or whether it's us as authors, or if it's, the protagonist as a character, they've grown up on so much trauma that the choice to be inactive is a survival tactic for them, right? Because they've discovered that if they don't react to what's going on, they won't get noticed and they won't get harmed by whatever trauma is happening. And that just spoke so deeply to me, because I had this character who, was experiencing exactly that of, I purposely made him inactive, and yet he was a central character to the story because he wasn't ready to act yet, early in the story. And so yeah, I think when it comes to differences between Western storytelling structures and non-Western story structures, we also have to consider, conflict isn't always king. It isn't always what's going to drive that story. A lot of times what's driving the story is what the character is going through. And the story is about the character developing rather than a character overcoming some sort of specific conflict.
Yeah, okay. All right then. I think we handled that one and just nailed it in. So,
Yeah, I'm vibing this.
I'm vibing this.
Yeah,
We're not holding back. This is great. So I'm loving how all our answers are going towards the next question, because I think this question with the benefits of just exploring different story structures. I don't think it's even with working within. I think it's just the right word is to use exploring. Like, what are those benefits of exploring different story structures that you don't see in your craft book?
Well, I think it's important to continue to push on your ideas of what narratives are. And I think that the more expansive we can be in our own consciousness, I think this goes back to Keir's point. Different story structures have different purposes.
Mm-hmm.
So my purpose in writing is healing and transcendence. Like, my stories that is what it is at the basis of why I'm writing these stories. And so they have to, the structures have to really, what I'm doing has to be very meticulous in terms of being able to bring about those themes, right?
Mm-hmm.
Because so there's a lot of, as Keir said, a lot of me, like, there's a going to something and a coming back to that. Like, there's a main river that's flowing through, and what is that river, and how do we seek and return, change, seek, return, transformed, seek, return, transformed, right? And there is a self-consciousness about it, right? There's not just this blind, let's go out and conquer new lands and be this hero. It's about what is the journey? How is my own vision changed, right? It's like the Japanese ox herder stories, right? It's about, like, where the whole journey is about the transformation of the inner self, so that the world itself, when you return to it, it's changed because your perception has changed, right? And I think that that's really important. And I also think, as artists, and this might be off topic, I think that as we change and as we transform and as we bring messages of social justice or whatever it is we bring to the world, that we need to, that our work can have a bigger and bigger impact in terms of transforming the people that we touch in our audiences. And I think that that's really important to keep in mind.
Definitely.
Yeah.
I don't know if I answered your question. I just went on this. I totally went on this
I feel
meandering
like
journey.
No, you did. That's perfect.
Yeah, I to build on that, I think so while I am focusing on my work as an agent right now, I'm also a writer, right? Like, that's how I got here. That's how I ended up in this place. I love books. I love writing books. I love reading them. And I wanted to see more. I wanted to see more diverse books available for people like me to read who wanted those kinds of books. And I think that when you start exploring outside of what we consider to be the Western story structures, the benefits for your craft alone, right? I think those are huge. When I was still, I mean, when I was writing more often, when I was writing much more often, I found that I truly struggled to shoehorn my stories into that 5-point or 3-act or whatever shape. And it wasn't until I made the effort to start looking outside of that I realized I didn't grow up with stories like with my family talking like this. I didn't grow up telling stories like this. That's not my culture. It's not how I learned. Do I read it a lot in stories? Do I watch it in movies? Of course I do. Western media is everywhere. Yes. But when I told a story, the natural path that story took was not the same one. Yeah. And I think that there are a lot of writers out there who suffer from that same sort of syndrome, where they can't get their story to fit into this 3-act right now. They can't get that story to fit into this little 5-point structure. They can't get it to fit into, any of those. And maybe they're telling themselves that there's something wrong with them or their writing or this story, but it's not. And if you learn about and you start to explore these other methods, these other structures of storytelling, and you lean into them, you might find that the story you're trying to write blooms in that moment, right? It finds its space, it finds its own shape, instead of trying to stick it into this little pigeonhole that you've that we've been told is the right way, right? And I think that is a huge benefit, even if it's not something you stay with as a writer, because we evolve over time. And from my perspective, now reading queries and seeking clients to turn into traditionally published authors, I find also that I am looking for things that are a little bit different like that too, things that are exploring structure in different ways, because I relate to that. That resonates with me as well, right? And it's not to say that I'm not going to love, a 3-act novel. It's not to say that I won't like that, but I do recognize that there are things that resonate with me that don't have a place, for lack of a better way to put it, that don't have a place in what we talk about when we talk about Western storytelling. But I want to see it there because it resonates with me and it's part of my experience.
That's kind of where I feel a lot of our audience will understand that whole trying to pigeonhole everything. Do you have any takes on that, Cindy? Do you agree, disagree, or you got a whole different opinion?
Well, I think my fellow panelists put it the best, so I'm just going to echo everything that they've said. Especially, Karen, don't pigeonhole yourself. For me, personally, that was a big thing, right? Because when I first started writing seriously, I was thinking, I was told by my mentors, you need to pick a lane and you need to stick with it. Whether you're going to be a science fiction author or a fantasy author or, a romance author, whatever it is that you want to write, build your brand, build your author name around a specific genre. And then if you want to change genres, you might want to think about coming up with a different pen name, but don't do the work of marketing yourself over and over again if you're going to write in multiple genres. Well, as you can see, I follow that advice. Not. So I think, big turning point for me was just letting go of that advice and saying, you know what? I like to write in different genres. I like to experiment and I like to explore. And I think a lot of this exploration has been about exploring different story structures and different cultures and seeing like how storytelling is done elsewhere that is outside of our traditional Western story structure. The 3-act story is great, but there's lots of other ways to write and tell a story. And once I let go of that, it really kind of just opened everything up for me in terms of I enjoyed writing again because I wasn't locked into, oh, shoot, this prompt, like it has to be a fantasy story. And just twisting myself into knots, into like fitting myself into these expectations that, in reality are self-imposed. Nobody is going to force you into that genre or into that pigeonhole if you don't let them do that, and so I decided I wasn't going to do that. So yeah, I think the biggest benefit for me is definitely just the freedom of being able to explore and experiment without having all these expectations set upon me.
Okay. That makes sense. So this is where we get the tough question, because I can see that we're all going to have a little like, many of these structures that we've been talking about were created in specific cultural contexts, as we've all established, like from our respective cultural backgrounds. So do you feel that if a writer or author who's not from that cultural context is overstepping, that they're like, basically not staying in their lane, and you utilize those story structures for their own stories and projects and the like? How do you feel about that? Do you feel that's overstepping? Do you feel that's okay because they're exploring it? Or do you think there's like some sort of middle ground of like nuance going on in there?
Well, again, I would, sorry, I just jumped in.
Oh, go for it. Go for it.
Go for it.
Again, I would really kind of return to this idea of the history of appropriation that's happened. And, think of the pre-colonial time, the spice trade, whatever, cultures intermingled. There was a natural exchange of culture, ideas. This is not something new that people exchange ideas. It's not something weird or strange. It's happened throughout history. What the problem is when you have this nexus of knowledge and power, as Foucault talks about, right? Because then the narratives are written in one way. Then you have to be a certain way to be acceptable. Then you have like these race paradigms. Then you have the erasure of like sexuality or the repression of sexuality or the degradation of women and all those kind of things. So we have to like first understand that like there is a certain exchange of cultures that has happened in the past that has been this I wouldn't say even, but just like this natural flow, right? That has been destroyed during the colonial period, right? So who are we now where we're post-colonial but not post-imperial, meaning the structures are still there, the dominant structures still operating in the cultural realm. And I think, so for example, I mean, many Western writers have been influenced by Indian thought. I mean, look at Emerson, Thoreau, even the background of Star Wars, all of these things. It's not that just the West has influenced the East. The East has influenced the West, but in a much quieter way, right? It's seeping in. But the thing is, it's not often been acknowledged, right? So so I write specifically in my tradition, although I grew up in the West, so I also know the Western tradition. But in my tradition, there is in India and there is a tradition called parampara, which means school or line, like school of philosophy. So if you were to write something, you acknowledge who came before you, who came before you, who came before you. And there's this idea of like, we're these individuals, but we're not just these individuals. We're in a sea of thought. We're influenced by this sea of people around us, by our ancestors, by everything that's come. It's all in our unconscious, collective unconscious, right? So in that sense, how can you say, it's hard to think about definitive boundaries. But the thing that I think is really important is this idea of really doing that work of understanding your own positionality when you're writing. If I'm writing a character that's not from my background or who I am, being very aware of what that is. And I think the consciousness and also the idea of recognizing where you're taking things from or where you're being inspired by should be part of your acknowledgements, should be part of that. I still struggle with, with stories that are written from someone completely outside the culture, but I think that it can be done in a way that is
still respectful.
Respectful, conscious, and can be incredibly powerful. So I don't want to rule that out because I think to do so it again puts up walls and puts up limitations and I think it's really in the way that it's done.
It's the execution, not just the intention.
I want to jump on that and say, yes, purpose matters, your intention matters, and then what you choose to do with that after, right? Because we are, you said this, I think just differently, but there's a power dynamic. Power matters. The power balance is very important here. I think that if, let's say a white writer with no connection or background to any non-white cultures, right? If they were to write a book or a work that used a structure like a cyclic structure or like a nested structure or something, and then they did not, and they were celebrated for it and all of this stuff without acknowledging and without saying, well, look, others have been writing like this, other cultures have been using this structure. I just found that it resonated with me in these ways, right? And in doing so, I hope that I enriched that structure by adding my story, but these are other stories with that. These are other stories from the culture, from, if they did not do that, I would have problems. I would have problems, right? But if they did say, well, I acknowledge that I didn't learn this because I am a genius, right? I learned this from studying the stories of those who wrote with this sort of structure, right? And found that I enjoyed it and I loved it. And there was something there that spoke to me. And so I told my story this way because I was disenfranchised in these ways and I could not enact my agency in these ways, or I had to struggle with these obstacles like this, and I couldn't go through them. I had to go around them. And so my story goes around them too, right? It's all about identity. It all comes back to your identity and your investment in whatever you're borrowing from. Because I think cultural cross-pollination is a beautiful thing, but cultural appropriation is not. And it comes back to using that power balance. For a personal perspective on this, my heritage is Indian, and I am consistently denied my Caribbean culture because when I leave the Caribbean, people don't think I'm Caribbean. It's like, history? No, history's not a thing that you learned, which is okay. It's okay if it's not a thing that you learned. It's fine. I was terrible at history, honestly. I think I barely know my own. So it's okay, but I struggle with that too, because so much of the language that I grew up with, the Trinidadian Creole that I grew up with, yes, there are Bhojpuri words in the Creole, but we use like West African structures, right, for our sentences. And when I speak like that, or I use words like that, and I want to use it in my own work when I am writing, I always stop and I go, is this okay? And my friends have to be, Keir, your family has been here for generations. Yes, it's okay. You're Trinidadian, you're Caribbean. It doesn't matter that other people think that this is a strictly West African thing. It's not. It is something that I grew up with. This was a blend. This was a cultural exchange. It certainly wasn't a peaceful one because it came from bridging enslaved people with indentured people and mixing those cultures. The root of it is still from the colonization that happened to us, right? Like, but this is the product now. And I could never say, no, don't borrow, don't mix, don't try, because I know that my own culture is a product of that. Yeah. So it comes back to your intention and your purpose.
Yeah. Right on.
What about you, Cindy? What are you thinking about this? Because it's a tough one, but I think you got it.
This is such a loaded question. And I know we get asked of it a lot when we're on panels, especially if you're from a marginalized community. So I just want to preface it by saying, if you're someone looking to write in a culture that's different from your own, and you're looking for permission from any one of us on this panel to do it, you are looking at the wrong people to do that. There is no single person who's going to be able to give you permission to write in another culture. It just doesn't exist. And if you think that it does, then you're already in the wrong mentality. I'm just going to tell you that right off. So I think, you know, a lot of what Kara and Shilpa have already said about, you know, intention is absolutely true. You know, you start with, do you have the best intentions at heart? Are you trying to approach the subject with respect? Do you have an appreciation for the culture that you're trying to enter and write about, things like that? I think all of that adds to your starting point. So I don't necessarily think that it's overstepping, but I do think that, you know, you have to be very, very careful, and you have to be very mindful of what you're doing, and you have to just approach your project with the deepest respect, and know that, you know, sensitivity readers are not an option. And you're probably gonna have to put in a lot more work. I mean, there's no property about it. You're going to have to put in a lot more work to write this type of story than one in which you're more comfortable and you're more familiar with and you have the background for. So yeah, it's, you know, approach it with respect, be mindful, be intentional, and put in the work.
Well, I think that you did a good job, so I say it's fine. So this is the fun part, because this means that I get book recommendations, the audience gets book recommendations. So what are some your favorite books that utilize, I'm not even going to say non-Western, I'm not even going to say non-traditional, just story structures that aren't commonly talked about in craft books?
Kara, I'm going to give this one to you because I need to think about this for a second.
Yeah.
I knew that would happen. Okay. I too truly struggled with this question. The one that comes to mind most immediately for me, and the only one that stayed in my mind for any length of time, was The Devourers. I believe it's written by Indra Das. And that book meandered. It was lovely. It was a story of ramble. In fact, I very rarely read books twice unless I'm doing editing or revision, like very purposefully. And I actually decided that I wanted to, by the time this airs, I would have read it already. But I have the intention to give it a second read just for the style. I really enjoy that. I do think that there are people out there who will not, because they are so used to, we like what we like, and we are comfortable, and we like what we're comfortable with, right? And so for people who are really into this sort of 3-act or 5-point or 7 or 9 or however many, you know, whatever, that triangle pyramid thing, if you like that, and that specifically, and very little else, this is maybe not the book for you. But I loved it. I thought it was so well done. I thought it was it threw me at first because I didn't understand what was happening or understand why it was written this way. But that quickly disappeared for me. So you say that's my main recommendation. I'm still trying to think of others because, again, and I think this is something Shilpa said way at the beginning, is that we, having grown up and, you know, colonized as we have been, you can probably find that structure, that 3 or 5 or whatever structure in everything. You can fit it into most things because that's how we've learned to engage. That's how we've learned to connect, right? We've learned to connect with that. So it's been very hard for me to identify ones that are completely outside of that aren't much older, like say 1001 Nights, or I think you mentioned did you mention the Moderator?
Yes.
Yes. Like those, you know, definitely come to mind. But for more recent reads, like in the last year or a few years even, Yeah, I The Space Between Worlds is another very good one. I love that book. It's definitely in my top 3. It is a science fiction novel. I feel like this could be considered a story within a story, or simply maybe not nonlinear, but there's certainly a side story, because there's a story that happens and comes to an end before we come back to the main story. And that kind of side story, you know, is not as commonly found. And I loved it. It totally blew me away. I got to the end of that story and I went, there's 25% of this book left. Oh my God, there's more.
Yeah.
You got
For
one?
me, sorry. Yeah. For me, thank you for sharing that. I love that. They're both on my list now. But the book that keeps coming up in my mind is the writer actually is Gloria Anzaldua. And she was an author and scholar of Chicana cultural theory and feminist theory. And she had a book that I absolutely loved called Borderlands, La Frontera. And it dealt really a lot with this idea of hybridity, and including in her use of language. So she would seamlessly go in and out of Spanish and English, and just, you would read it, and I don't know Spanish, so I'd read it and I would just have to be in the context and the flow of her writing, because then there would be a sentence that I didn't completely get. But I think that was, again, pushing the reader to into that place of discomfort. Okay, like, I'm not spoon feeding you here, so I'm pushing you into that place of like, oh, you don't necessarily belong, or you don't necessarily have access to this. So what does that invoke in you? And I love that about her writing. She really deals with issues of colonialism, heteronormativity, male dominance, queer theory. So she's really, really, she was really breaking a lot of, I wouldn't say she, they were breaking a lot of boundaries in terms of how can we look beyond. And she was doing this, they were doing this 2 decades ago or more. And so I feel like their work has really been formative for me.
I have written that down because I'm like, oh, it has English and Spanish. I know Spanish. I'm like, yes. So, Cindy, I know it's a hard one, but can you think of any of them? Just one.
Oh, I love talking about books. I think that's why we're here. And luckily enough, I think I've recovered from my recent bout of illness to have enough of the brain fog lifting so I can remember these books, because I know, like, even last week I was not remembering, like, I was barely remembering my own name. Let's just put it that way. But yeah, okay. So I know I touched upon second person POV earlier. And I do have a recommendation for a book that uses that structure. And it is called The Raven Tower by Leckie. You may recognize Anne's name from Ancillary Justice, and that is science fiction. The Raven Tower is fantasy. And I'll be honest, I have this book in a physical paperback format, and I picked it up because I had a physical TBR that I was trying to get through. I'm like, I am going to make a dent in this mountain. So help me. And it was the middle of 2021, and I picked up this book and I read the first line, and I was like, nope, I do not have the mental willpower and emotional energy to work through this book right now. I'm very sorry, Leckie, but I'm going to set this book down. And I did. I walked away from it. And a lot of people are going to have that reaction. And then a couple months ago, I picked it up again and I looked at it like, this sounds interesting. And I did the work. I read through it, and it wound up being like such a beautiful story that once I got into the rhythm of the narrative, the second person narrative, I was like, oh wow, this is a really interesting world building that she did. with like fascinating characters, and I would totally read a whole nother like series in this world. I do believe it's a standalone, however. So if you're into series, this may not be the book for you, but really good example of a second person POV done really well. The Raven Tower by Leckie. Another one, another book that is in a non-traditional story structure that it won awards and it was very well deserved. It's called The Empress of Salt and Fortune by Nebo. And it's a novella, so it's short, but it is an example of a story where there's a story that's at the forefront. There's a narrator at the forefront. And it is part of a series, so there's more coming. And then there's a story in the background. And it's interesting because the story in the background is your traditional story. It's your story of battles and political intrigue and whatever. But the story in the foreground is the quiet one. And it was just so interesting the way Nebo wrote the story. The prose is gorgeous. She's just such a fantastic writer. And this way that she framed and structured the story, I was just blown away. And it was, it was a short read. Again, it's novella, but and it won, I forget which awards it won, but it was well deserved. She definitely deserved it. And then the example of talk story that I mentioned earlier is Woman Warrior by Maxine Kingston. It's personal narrative, but a lot of the stories that she talks about in there are passed down in that talk story format. And it's just a really, really great collection of stories and essays in that book. And then for a craft book, I mentioned this earlier as well, Craft in the Real World by Matthew Salasis. It really spoke to the person I used to be who thought that I was going to go get an MFA. And then I didn't. And the reasons that he outlines in why marginalized writers often don't get an MFA were exactly why I didn't get one. And I just didn't know how to put it. I didn't know how to tell people why I walked away from, pursuing an MFA. And he just laid it out so beautifully as to why, the traditional MFA format is not conducive to helping marginalized writers. So that to me was a really eye-opening book. A little heartbreaking, but he also gives you exercises in the back if you decide to run a critique group, how to do it with a more mindful eye toward being more inclusive. So that's great. And then finally, a more mainstream example of a non-traditional story structure, which I think a lot of us have probably heard of, is Station 11 by Canadian writer Emily St. John Mandel. So I've not seen the HBO series. I know there's an HBO miniseries, so I can't speak to the miniseries. But the book itself is really wonderfully written. Emily St. John Mandel has a really easy way with phrasing and with prose. Like Nebo, it's just gorgeous, but also it's very accessible. And the way that she takes you through the story, through what's going on in the present and then what's happening in the flashbacks, it's just masterful because it folds the story bit by bit. And so you think you know one thing, and then you learn through a flashback or you learn through what's happening in present that, oh no, it's all different. It's all something else is going on. Something else happened. And it was one of the books that, I often read on ebook first. If I love the book, I'll go get it in paper because my first love is paper, but I live in a 900 square foot house. I don't have room for that much paper. So this was one of the books where I read it on ebook and I was like, damn, I'm going to read this again. And so I ran out and got the paperback. And so yeah, it's, I know it's an interesting recommendation, but I just love the way that this story unfolded. And it doesn't have your 3-act structure. It doesn't have your proactive protagonist. Things just kind of happen and you're just swept along in what's going on. I will warn you if you don't know about the story, it is a pandemic story. So if you're not ready for that, then possibly not. But she handled the pandemic way better than Stephen King did in The Stand. So I will say that. So I did think that she did her research when it came to making sure this was believable. But yeah, those are my recommendations.
Okay, all right, you're doing more than one. Okay. Awesome. I am totally going to be checking all these out from my local library, and if they don't have it, I'm using an interlibrary loan. So
With it.
it was worth it. So here's one of those, is the chicken or the egg that came first? Did you plan to write your story a certain way and end up transforming a different way? Or did you just knew this is how I'm going to write it, this is what's going to happen, and you execute it from start to finish that particular structure?
I didn't know anything. My positionality coming in to write is one of utter humility and emptiness. I felt actually the story descend into me over the period of 3 years. And it was actually seven interconnected stories that then again, like the raw material didn't come from here, came from there. And I received, and as I received, I started fleshing out, oh, wow, there's 7 stories and they're interconnected and what's happening here. And then I think the other element is time, because I think we're in a society where everyone's like productive. And this is like, this is capitalism, right? This is part of capitalism. And how do we resist that? Well, I've been working on this for 12 years, at least, maybe more, and part of that is my intentionality that as I write this story that is dismantling kind of a lot of the painful history of my country, and wanting to bring healing and transformation, that I had to be able to embody that. And so I had to do a lot of my own inner transformation and healing in order to understand what really does that mean? How do we transcend? How do we heal? In order to be able to embody that. And time is there in all of our work, because time, it allows the layers to rise up in a story. It depends on what kind of story you're writing, but if you're writing a story that has history or has deeper layers or whatever, you see sometimes stories out there that come out before they're fully cooked, right? And so the idea of time is that let's let these layers reveal themselves. Let's let these ideas bubble up. And as I've been writing, there's been so much shifting. And the way I see my writing is that it's almost like a stage. And I was given, I felt this descent, and I'm working with kind of what's happening. And all of a sudden another curtain gets pulled back. And it's like, oh, okay, the story is deepening. And now it's 3 stories, but what's happening in these 3 stories? Oh, another layer is getting pulled back. Oh, here's a theme that's working its way. Here's another theme. Another layer gets pulled back. Oh my God, this is happening. So it's deeper, more complex nuances, layers that are coming in and threading their way. So it's weaving this very intricate tapestry. So I move, my trilogy is 500,000 words. I can move in and out. If I think about something, I'm I know where that sentence is and I know what I need to do. And then that thread, what does that thread do and everything else? And that's part of the reason why I didn't just sell the first book. Part of the reason is that I feel like it's coming, it's like triplets. It's not 3 kids in a row. It's really triplets. They have to gestate together. So I'm honoring this process. And it's not been easy because we're in this society, it's about production, but this is what I'm doing. And so it's very organic for me. I'm not choosing. I'm aware, I'm educated, I read a lot, so I know what's out there. I'm aware of the influences, I do the work, but there's also a deep surrender to the process. And a deep just filling up with the process that happens. And I think that allows the story to unfold as it should, because the characters are doing what they want. I know them inside and out. And now, so they can do what they want to do, right? I am just there to hold the story, to witness the story, to shape the story.
Which is completely fair. I was like mesmerized while you were saying, like, wow, this is a whole story on its own.
It is. No, that's
how-
amazing.
But it works. What do you think, Keir?
I, as a writer, I am what they commonly call a plantser. So I'm not a pantser exactly, and I'm not a plotter. I've never been a okay. Like honestly, I was a pantser, and then and I would work like that. The story would be written, or I would write as I go, and then I figure it out later. And as I started to work on like revisions and editing, and I wanted to figure out that structure, then I started in my next projects trying to figure out what are my signposts and so on. And that's when I encountered the whole, ugh, it doesn't fit into this mold problem, and moved on. I do want to put a word in, I think, from editing and the editing and revision perspective, because again, the work I do now is not so much as a writer, but as an agent, it's a lot more of being an editor or being like a reader and a critique person for your clients. I think that sometimes a manuscript or a book will come to you, you meaning, I guess, from the editorial perspective, right? And it has a shape, but it's not quite fitting into its shape yet. Like it needs a little bit of adjustment. It needs to lean a little bit more this way and tilt its head a little bit more that way. And yeah. And I think that it is your job as a good editor not to try to stick it into a predetermined structure, but to work with the shape of the story that you have, and to make it's the best version of itself. And with that in mind, I do feel like even those, I think, who plan their work, who are plotters and they plan their work and they write it this way, every plotter I know says that it almost, it doesn't always work out quite that cleanly. They'll plan it, they'll plot it, but it will not get from start to finish and look exactly like the layout that they have. Right? There will be other things that happen. And I think that from the perspective of editing a work like that or similar, it's really, really important to sit with your author's intentions, right? And to sit with the intentions of the work, and what were the author's intentions and what actually happened in this story. Are they the same anymore? That's a discussion that you need to have. And so yeah, I feel like a lot of the work I've seen, even if it had like a plan, what the story became or what the manuscript became wasn't always that plan. And so there was always room for it to change and grow in revisions and editing after that.
Yeah. Can I just add a point, Magz?
Yeah, for sure.
Yeah, I just want I totally agree with everything you're saying, Keir, and I just want to add this in terms of revision process. I think it's really important as writers to have feedback. I've had a writing partner for decades, and he's amazing. And we have a weekly commitment, rain or shine. We meet, we give each other 5 to 7 pages. It doesn't seem like a lot, but it goes a long way. 5 to 7 really, really good pages. And then you're spending the time as an editor, really thinking about those pages. It's actually quite a bit. And so we've had this commitment, and it's really important because I feel like sometimes I read works where the author gets into their own head and they think the motivation works for like this character doing X or Y, but really they're just like, out in left field. And so I think it's really important to have someone that can be like, hey, like, I don't think that motivation works. And then you make an argument. Well, I think it does because of this, or that character is missing this, or that character is out of alignment here with who they were on page, 12. And so I think that is incredibly valuable in the writing process.
Absolutely.
And what do you think, Cindy?
So I would love to echo what Shilpa said about finding a critique partner. I've mentioned a couple of times I have a writing group. Having a critique partner is awesome when it comes to making sure that, one, you're accountable for producing work, especially when you don't feel like writing. Like sometimes a really good critique partner will help you just, push you along. But also to have that step back, that outside view of, is this working? Is this not working? Does this make sense? So yeah, when I'm writing, first of all, I'm a discovery writer. I have tried outlining. I have tried the 7-point plot structure. I have tried index cards. I have tried Scrivener. I have tried so many different techniques, guys. None of it has taken. Okay. I have written 10,000 word outlines for a novel, gotten 1,000 words into the outline, and just threw the rest of it out because the story just went sideways. So to answer your question in short, no, I never plan on using the story structure because I'm not an outliner. I don't plan my stories. I wish I did. So I very much admire Keir, who's more of a hybrid. But yeah, so I often start with a character because my stories tend to be very character driven. And I usually have to have a voice in my head of whether it's the character's voice or a voice for the story. There's a tone or a narrator for the story that may not necessarily be your protagonist. So once I have one of those pieces, I can usually sit down and start writing the story and get going. So yeah, I will say that the story that came out in analog, actually, this one had a funny backstory to it. So I wrote it on a prompt. The prompt was exploration, which I think fits this theme of exploring different story structures pretty well. And this is a story where I looked at it, it was like, I should be a fantasy writer. This should be easy for a fantasy writer. Why is it that all I can think of is a science fiction story? So it wound up being like the second science fiction story I've written in the last 10 years. I mean, before, at the time I wrote it, I've written a lot since then, but like at the time I wrote it, it was obviously science fiction was not my forte. At least I didn't think it was. And I just, I had that voice, the voice of the mother character in my mind, and I just started writing, and I got to the end of the story and I looked at it and I was like, there's no freaking plot to this story. There's no 3-act, much less 1-act. Like there's no plot to this story, but there's, a story. And I was on deadline, and I had, I think, like a few hours to basically edit this thing and ship it off to the editor. I turned it into my husband to look at because I was like, all right, I just need someone to tell me that this story is not crazy. And my husband's not, a huge science fiction reader. He's not a writer. He's an engineer. So that tells you, a little bit of his mentality and his background. But he read it and he's like, I don't really get it. And I'm thinking, well, this is great feedback for a story. But I had to turn something in. So I shipped it off anyway. I was like, it is what it is. And lo and behold, the entire panel of editors who read the story freaking loved it. I was like, are you serious? But there's no plot to the story. And it just goes to show that, sometimes it's not about the plot. Sometimes the story is what it is. And so, yeah, I don't plan specific story structures for my stories.
I learned a lot. A lot has come in, a lot has come out. And I think we've left our audience with a lot to think on. So one final question, just a lightning. What is one piece of advice you would give to writers who are finding that it's hard to fit that story into that 3-act, 9-dot, whatever structure?
I would say, know yourself, realize yourself. And as you do, as you gain strength in understanding who you are, so will your writing. So will every single thing that comes and emanates from you. It's only when you're trying to be something else that you can never be yourself. So know yourself, ground yourself in that, root yourself in that, love yourself in that, hold yourself in that, and then branch out. And then don't worry about it. Surrender.
What about you, Keir? Got any takes?
What's advice I'd give to someone whose story can't fit? I mean, if it can't fit into, if your story doesn't fit into the, your story is the peg, right? If it doesn't fit into the round hole, well, don't put it there. If it doesn't fit into the square hole, don't put it there, right? Like if it doesn't fit into the triangle, don't put it there. So if you find that you're struggling with that, write whatever you believe really comes next. And I think Shilpa's advice really fits with that too, is that ground yourself, and wherever your story is grounded and whoever your characters are, right? Let what you've established guide you as to what happens next, and just let it come. It's sort of natural, take its natural path. I have found that works best for me, and it certainly works best for most of the writers that I know. And I say most because obviously I can't speak for every writer. I know, but every writer I've had this conversation with, that is what works best for them. And especially if you find that you're hitting a point where something's not working, right? I definitely believe in just moving forward and finishing the thing and then coming back and fixing it later. I think that's, but if there's something that's not working, the problem, right, also for lack of a better term, because it's not necessarily a problem, is usually further back. And if you go further back, you'll often find where the shape of the story wasn't quite right. And you can make that change to allow it to move as it should.
And Cindy, what would be your takeaway advice for someone who's trying so hard to fit their story?
So I'm probably going to get sued for trademark infringement, but I'm just going to say, just do it. All right. Experiment, explore, just put something down on a page, see if it works later. But also the other piece of advice that I would say is to read. If you don't read other stories, other types of stories, if you don't watch other types of movies, if you don't absorb other types of any form of storytelling, you're not going to know what you're missing out on. And so any sort of, I call it osmosis by story. So anytime you're just absorbing all these stories by osmosis, it kind of feeds your repertoire of what you're capable of as a writer. And you may not consciously think of it when you're sitting down and creating story, but it will bubble up from your subconsciousness and flow onto the page. So I would say if you're not experimenting and you're not exploring other story structures by writing it, then do it by reading and absorbing other stories.
Yeah. I think that's a lot of information for everyone. And I want to first thank all of our panelists because, we got deep. And I think all of us are going to have to take a collective step back, and take a breather, drink some water, go on a walk. Maybe don't go on a walk too far because we do want you to stay to answer questions. So we're going to wrap up with some things that you want to plug in your socials, where people can find you. If you have a newsletter, I will make sure all of that is in the channel. So we'll start with Shilpa because, oh my goodness, I am probably going to buy all your books anyway, so I might as well know where to buy.
You are so sweet. Thank you, Magz. So you can find me. My website is shilpaagarwal.com. My first name is on my background there. And my handles are at author Shilpa, SHILPA, and at Radio Life Force. Radio Life Force is, of course, my radio show. So you can connect with me there, and it's on Twitter, Instagram. I'm not really on Facebook. So Yeah, so that's where you can connect with me. I would love, drop me a note on my website. There's a place you can contact me and say hello. I don't think I'm going to be available for the Q&A, but I would love to hear from anyone. And please just mention you were on, you saw me on WriteHive, and I would love to connect.
What about you, Keir?
Well, the only thing I have to promote is that I'm open to query. My manuscript wish list is linked on the ALA website, and you should also be able to find a link to it on Twitter. On Twitter and all other socials, I am at my name. So it's just Keir Alekseii. Very fortunate that I have such a strange and unique name that I can just be at me everywhere. It's also my website is also keiralekseii.com. So you can find me at any of those places. And, whether your story meanders or moves in circles or whatever have you, if you think that it is a good fit for me, by all means, send me your query.
And Cindy, where can people follow you and learn more about your work and what's coming up next?
Yeah, so I've got a story that is out in analog right now called Faster Than Falling Starlight, and you can find that in the May-June issue. It's probably going to be in bookstores for maybe another few days to a week at the most before the next issue drops. So if you're interested in checking that out, I check out a bookstore that carries analog. I also have another story coming out in Paul Pels later this year, probably in the next month or so. But I post all my updates on when stories are coming out and where to find them on my website at chhung.com, and Facebook and Twitter at chhungwrites. And so, yeah, that's how you can keep up to date on what's going on. Or you can, I have a newsletter that I post to periodically. I admit I'm not super great about sending updates through there, but you can sign up for that on my website as well. Thanks for having me.
So I want to thank again all of our panelists. This has been a treat. I have so many notes that I'm going to be going through because there are some stories that I'm like, yeah, it's not fitting in that 3x structure. I guess got to go back to the roots for me. So thank you all so much for watching, and see you in the Q&A.